Our last presentation on this panel is from my former colleague Yun Sun from the Stimson Center. Yun directs the China work at Stimson and is the co-director of the East Asia program there. She is a doctoral candidate at Hopkins. She worked in China for the International Crisis Group, among other organizations, and really has a very versatile menu of China expertise. She has looked at decision-making inside China, real insights into how foreign policy decisions are made in China, but also has looked at China's foreign policies towards the problematic parts of Asia around the Chinese territory. Today we've asked her to focus on ASEAN. She's done a lot of work on Myanmar, so we've asked her to focus on ASEAN as an arena for US-China competition. Welcome, Yun.
Thank you, Ellen. Thank you for organizing this conference, and thank you for having me. You're my former boss at Stimson Center, so thank you for yet another opportunity to talk about my research. I know that I'm almost the last thing standing between you and lunch, so I'll try to be as concise as possible in the discussion of U.S.-China competition in Southeast Asia. So there have been a lot of discussion as for why this escalation of tension or escalation of contention between U.S. and China has transpired itself so quickly. And there are discussions or debates as for when this all started. Some people attribute it to 2008, China's come out party at the Olympics. Some would say that it's somewhere around 2010 when China first termed the South China Sea as a part of China's core national interest. But I would argue that a lot of these changes in Chinese foreign policy and foreign strategy started with Xi Jinping's inauguration in 2013. And that's when you see that the Chinese foreign policy really takes a more assertive or progressive, but not in the Korean Peninsular sense, more assertive direction. And that is certainly very true for the Southeast Asia region. So one thing happened in 2013 that is important for Chinese foreign policy, and that is what they call the Foreign Policy or the China's Periphery Working Conference. And that conference basically determined that the Chinese foreign policy or diplomacy towards China's periphery in China's neighborhood is a priority area for Chinese foreign policy. Why is this important? This is important because under Hu Jintao, during the 10 years between 2002 to 2012, what the Chinese jokingly call the decade of great inaction for Chinese foreign policy, there was this debate between which one is more important for China, whether it is a relationship with countries in China's neighborhood, on China's periphery, or it is a relationship with great power, especially the United States. And the debate goes as for whether a good U.S.-China relationship will help China to build a better relationship with its neighbors because U.S. will stop undermining China's role in the region, or China should focus on building a better relationship with its Asian neighbors so that U.S. cannot exploit the vulnerability in those relationships. So this periphery foreign policy working conference in 2013 pretty much once and for all settled that debate. And Xi Jinping has defined the priority area for China's foreign policy to be China's periphery. And China's periphery, of course, is very big. There's several different regions: Northeast Asia, Central Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia. And so which one is more important for China? And I would argue that in China's foreign policy, Southeast Asia has been defined as a primary area that China needs to focus on. And a couple of reasons. First of all, before Xi Jinping stepped in, Southeast Asia was regarded as an area where the United States has heightened its competition with China for regional influence. And that campaign in the Chinese perception was spearheaded by the Rebalance to Asia strategy by the Obama administration. So what the Chinese witnessed, what they believe that had happened under the Obama administration, is the intensification of the South China Sea problem, the expansion of democracy in mainland Southeast Asia, especially after the model of Myanmar. And then on the economic arena, there's also the TPP, which the Chinese perceive as a regional arrangement engineered by the United States that excluded China. So that's a competition with the United States. And then if you compare it to other sub-regions in China's periphery, Southeast Asia is also regarded as a primary direction where China needs to consolidate its influence. And this is in comparison with, for example, Northeast Asia is undergoing major uncertainty because of the Korean Peninsula. And in South Asia, India has been resistant towards the Chinese expansion of influence, especially through the CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. And then in the case of North Asia, or in the case of Central Asia, when China was pushing forward the Belt and Road Initiative, there has been resistance from Russia, which sees Central Asia as Russia's traditional sphere of influence. So Southeast Asia is regarded as, well, first of all, is adjacent to China. And secondly, China has had this traditional historical or cultural influence over the region. So that's the second reason why Southeast Asia is important. And certainly, from the philosophy of Xi Jinping's foreign strategy, China's periphery is the first step for China to restore its influence or restore its status of the Middle Kingdom. If we look at Xi Jinping's emphasis today, for example, on the harmonious aspect of international relations and how he has emphasized the community of common destiny, in my analysis, what it really represents is a Chinese version of a moralistic hegemonic stability that China tries to pursue. If you think about the Chinese political culture or the traditional Chinese culture, the Confucianism emphasizes that international order or order itself does not originate from equality among all the members. Instead, it originates from the hierarchy or strictly implemented hierarchy that is defined by the moral codes of the society. So the order basically originates from what China sees as a hierarchy of the international order. And this vision pretty much resembles the hegemonic stability theory, but with a very, very different set of moral codes. So the concept, if you remember, one movie that I really love to see is from 2002, Zhang Yimou's movie Heroes. And if you remember, by the end of the movie, the assassin decided not to assassinate the emperor of Qin. And when he was asked why, he wrote two Chinese characters on the ground, 天下, which means all under heaven. So what that reflects is that he believes that one strong central government that's controlling all China will be able to prevent war and prevent instability, and that is in the benefit of the Chinese people. So that's a very vivid manifestation of the Chinese traditional political culture and how they see peace and stability. So in this vision, this 天下 system basically sees a world centered on and dominated by a superior, both morally and materially, a morally benevolent country or civilization, and traditionally in the Chinese concept, that is Middle Kingdom. And the hegemon's superiority in military and economic power forms the foundation for peace and stability through the deterrence and coercion. And the moral superiority of the hegemon, as primarily demonstrated by the hegemon's provision of public good. Think about China's concessional loans and Chinese financing for development projects and infrastructure projects across the world. That kind of provision of public good anchors the desirability, or in the Chinese perception, the desirability of the hegemonic hierarchy among the system. So that's pretty much how China sees the region and sees the desired international order under the Xi Jinping administration. So now coming back to Southeast Asia, I will discuss primarily 4 areas of where this contest or competition between U.S. and China are transpiring: the military, economic, in terms of value, and last but not least, the outlook for the future of the region or the regional security architecture. Militarily, of course, the key issue that has been the most contentious between U.S. and China in the region is South China Sea. And starting from 2010, there's a debate as well who started it. We say that China started it when China first defined the South China Sea as core national interest. And then the Chinese counter-argument is that, well, no, you started it when you had the pivot to Asia or rebalance to Asia. So regardless of who started it, the confrontation between U.S. and China regarding the South China Sea, especially the access and the anti-access aspects of the two militaries, have been escalating. So what the Chinese angle, what the Chinese strategy is to use economic means, economic statecraft, and political coercion to change or to shape the position of the two main claimant countries in Southeast Asia, Vietnam and the Philippines. And with Philippines, it has been relatively successful with Duterte. And with Vietnam, with this current Vietnamese government, the contentious aspect or the confrontational aspect of Vietnam's policy towards China on South China Sea has also been mitigated. On the other hand, China has also been using the artificial island that China is reclaiming in the South China Sea to continue to strengthen the military control that China has over the South China Sea. So from U.S. perspective, U.S. has been helping the maritime countries in Southeast Asia to enhance their capability. And from the Maritime Security Initiative in 2015, U.S. has been helping, making contributions both financially and in terms of capacity building to help Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, and Malaysia to increase their capability to maintain maritime security. And on the other hand, we know that the United States has been also strengthening its own presence in the South China Sea through the FONOP operation, the Freedom of Navigation operation, to use FONOPs to strengthen and to consolidate the U.S. right to freedom of navigation in that region, which is a very sore spot for China. And that's the military. Then in terms of the economic competition, traditionally, ASEAN countries, they rely on China economically, but they also depend on the United States for their security. And through this dichotomy, ASEAN countries try to place a balance of power between U.S. and China. But under the Belt and Road Initiative, what we see is China has been increasing its investment, concessional loans, and the what they call the export credits, basically buyer's credit, into the infrastructure development throughout Southeast Asia, both in mainland Southeast Asia and in maritime Southeast Asia. And the amount of financing that China has contributed to this campaign is significant, is tremendous. Because the Chinese financing has been dominated and implemented by the government, by either they're financed by the policy banks or supported by government directives, it is very difficult for the United States to have a parallel competition or parallel model to compete with the Chinese model of development. So some of the additional ideas is that last year Japan also raised a more or less competitive idea called the Quality Infrastructure Project, basically targeting or criticizing Chinese infrastructure projects in the region for being of poor quality, both in terms of the software and the hardware. So the idea is that Japan might use a higher standard or the higher quality of infrastructure project to compete with the Chinese ones. And under the Obama administration, U.S.-ASEAN Connectivity Initiative was proposed, but the strengthening of the investment or the economic relations with ASEAN countries has lagged behind what the Chinese have been doing. Then, of course, under the Trump administration, what we see is that there's a new strategy called Indo-Pacific Strategy that was proposed, that was raised first in the November of 2017. And if you ask ASEAN countries would like to argue that they are the center of the Indo-Pacific strategy, geographically, not in terms of the prioritization that the Trump administration has attached to it. In the Indo-Pacific strategy, a lot of people talk about the Quad, U.S., Australia, Japan, and Indonesia. And India. The four countries can play the pillar role of the Indo-Pacific strategy. But what people have been waiting to see is what are the substance of this Indo-Pacific strategy. In the Rasina dialogue this past January in India, some of the U.S. military leaders have raised the idea that Indo-Pacific strategy is a U.S. counter strategy to counter the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. And that raised a lot of questions because Belt and Road Initiative at this stage is primarily economic-oriented, infrastructure-dominated project or economic campaign. So how to counter that from a military perspective has been an intriguing question people try to answer. And this past summer, the Trump administration seems to have provided some answers as for why this is a counter to China's Belt and Road Initiative. For example, But before the end of July, Secretary of State Pompeo made the commitment that the United States is going to invest $130 million into the new technology, energy, and infrastructure projects in the Indo-Pacific region. And U.S. will also contribute another $25 million to expand the science and technological export from the United States to the region. And then, in addition, U.S. this year will also spend $50 million to help the Indo-Pacific countries to build their new network and to promote the infrastructure development. And then most recently, I think last week, the Trump administration, there was reports from the Wall Street Journal about Trump administration trying to push a new agency, a new organization called the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation that will integrate multiple institutions currently within the U.S. government structure, such as the Development Credit Authority and the USAID. Then on the foundation of OPIC, Overseas Private Investment Corporation, this new organization, this new agency will have broad authorization of $60 billion of financing capability. Of course, this is subject to the approval of by the Congress, but that is the idea that the Trump administration has put on the table. So we are going to see more competition on the economic arena. Although, if you look at the size or the scale of the Chinese financing into the region, I think for $60 billion is probably not sufficient to compete with China. If you look at AIIB, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, the startup capital is $100 billion. Look at the Silk Road Fund that China started back in 2015. The total capital was $40 billion. And if you look at sporadic projects, the largest Chinese projects in Burma was $10 billion, the Jiapu Special Economic Zone. And the largest Chinese infrastructure project in Malaysia, the East Coast Rail Link that was just canceled by Mahathir, it was as high as $20 billion. If you put the numbers together, then there's still some discrepancy between what China has already thrown into the pot and what the U.S. has put on the table. That's economic competition. In terms of the value competition, and that's where the area of mainland Southeast Asia has become very interesting. So we know that Burma was under the military government's rule basically up until 2011. And then the democratization process in Cambodia has faced a lot of suppression from the central government, but it has been supported by the United States. And U.S. also plays an instrumental role in promoting the liberalization or the pluralism in countries such as Vietnam. So all these U.S. gestures with U.S. support of the democratization in the region, in the Chinese perception, is a ideological containment strategy or a color revolution or peaceful evolution, if you use the Chinese term, to undermine China's appeal in the region. And as a counter strategy, China has been emphasizing on China's soft power influence, China's value system. I don't know whether I'm not entirely comfortable calling it export of the Chinese ideology, because in maritime Southeast Asia, for China to export the authoritarianism model is very unlikely to succeed. But at least in mainland Southeast Asia, we do see Chinese government resources putting into what the Chinese call capacity building, political capacity building, that helps the ASEAN countries to, first of all, understand the China's development model, two, to seek experiences and also seek advice from the Chinese government as for how the Chinese political system has run under both a state-dominated authoritarianism politically, but capitalism in terms of the economic system. So just to, for example, give you one example, this past April, the Chinese Central Party School hosted a training program for the Vietnamese government. And the focus of that training program was on the management of internet and the management of information. So throughout 2 weeks in Beijing, what the Vietnamese officials, the information technology or the information management officials from Vietnam learned in China was, one, how to manage information on the internet, how to manage the media. Two, how to spearhead or how to strengthen the propaganda or the leading of the media by the political party. And three, the relationship between traditional media and the new media, especially internet, the social media. And four, how the Chinese government has managed the spread of information that is not in line with what the government wants to see on the internet. So this type of training programs has been quite widely spread out across Southeast Asian countries. And you see different levels of training as well. So Beijing usually hosts, the training programs happening in Beijing are usually for the central government officials. Then, for example, the provinces of Guangxi and provinces of Yunnan, they are targeting the provincial level of officials from Southeast Asian countries. And the number of such training programs is as high as hundreds each year. So that's a competition between two countries on the ideology or on the value aspect. Last but not least, we should talk a little bit about the regional security outlook or the regional security architecture and how the U.S. vision differs from the Chinese vision. So I argue that U.S. and China have complete opposite strategic vision about what the regional security structure should look like for not only Southeast Asia but also West Pacific and East Asia. So in the Chinese perception, Southeast Asia is naturally a component of China's innate sphere of influence. And in the Chinese perception, the presence of the United States in West Pacific by default and by its very existence is a damage to China's sphere of influence in that region. So like I just mentioned about hegemonic stability theory application in Xi Jinping's foreign policy, China's perception of the future of the region lies in a hegemonic stability version. And for example, if you think about Xi Jinping's comment in 2014 on the CICA conference, his comment was basically Asia is Asians' Asia, and Asian affairs should be managed by Asians. And that, at that time, was widely interpreted as a Chinese version of the Monroe Doctrine in the region, and it raised a lot of questions. So in the deliberation with the Chinese interlocutors and Chinese officials, and when we raised the issue that while U.S. has been embedded in the regional security structure basically since the end of World War II, their reaction is, in the Chinese perception, United States is an Asia-Pacific country, but it's not an Asian country. So the sense of exclusion is quite clear there. And then if you push the Chinese interlocutors even further, that U.S. has such an important and innate role here in the region, the Chinese reaction is that, okay, well, U.S. is welcome to come to Asia and stay in Asia. However, your presence must follow the frameworks and the principles defined by the countries in Asia. And that basically alludes to a regional security structure that China envisions for itself, which is dominated by China and hopefully supported either through economic statecraft or through political coercion, supported by Asian countries, where U.S. would not be able to play a dominant role. So what is the U.S. vision for the region? I'm a big fan of Professor Mike Green's argument on this issue. And Professor Green argued repeatedly that U.S. goal in the Asia region is not hegemonic stability. U.S. goal in the region is to have balance of power and to prevent the emergence of any major hegemon that can deny U.S. presence or deny U.S. access in the region. And I highly agree with that point of view. So then what we are seeing is that basically a collision of two competing visions for the region. One is hegemonic stability, the other one is balance of power. And the escalation of these two visions has intensified basically under Xi Jinping administration. So in the past, when the Chinese power was not as strong as it is today, U.S. and China, I think, were both willing to let ASEAN to play some central role. And remember the principle of ASEAN's centrality, and both governments have talked a lot about ASEAN centrality being part of their regional engagement strategy. But we don't hear that very much anymore. So the ASEAN centrality, under the condition or in the context of a heightened competition between US and China in the region, the ability for ASEAN to adjust or to moderate the conflicts between the two major powers and to try to play a dominant role in the regional affairs has been significantly reduced. So I'll stop there and hope that was not too long. Thank you so much.